Jake Sullivan thought he could handle any storm in his isolated mountain cabin, but nothing could prepare him for what he found. A German shepherd trapped in a deep snow hole, frozen and fighting for its life. As the storm rages on, Jake has no choice but to risk everything to save the dog. But what happens next will leave you stunned, uncovering a shocking truth that neither of them was prepared for. Jake Sullivan had always been at peace in the mountains. The rugged, snow-covered peaks and deep forests were his home, far removed from the chaos of society. His cabin, nestled deep within the range, was a sanctuary where he could escape the noise of the world. He'd lived there for years, cutting wood, hunting, and enjoying the isolation that came with it. It was on a cold winter evening that the storm began, quietly at first, but soon escalating into a fury. Jake had seen snowstorms before, but this one felt different. The wind howled as the snow fell in thick, heavy sheets. By the time Jake closed the door to his cabin and stoked the fire in the hearth, the storm had already begun to rage. The howling wind shook the walls of the cabin, and the snow quickly piled up outside. Inside, the warmth of the fire was a relief. Jake settled into his favorite chair by the window, watching the storm through the thick glass. The landscape beyond was disappearing as the snow piled higher. There was no way to travel in this, and he wasn't even sure if anyone else was out there. The storm felt like it was swallowing the world whole. Jake tried to relax, but a strange unease gnawed at him. Something wasn't right. The wind wasn't just howling, it was different. It felt as though the storm was alive, pushing against him, urging him to pay attention. For a moment, he sat there, staring out at the swirling white landscape. The feeling intensified, but Jake pushed it aside. He had lived in these mountains long enough to know that storms came and went, and most of them left no trace. He had faced worse, and this would pass too. Suddenly, a noise broke his thoughts. It was faint but distinct, a soft whimpering sound, like the cry of an animal in distress. Jake froze. It was barely audible, muffled by the storm, but it was there. His heart raced as he strained his ears, trying to locate the source of the sound. It wasn't an echo of the wind. It was something else, something alive. Without thinking, Jake grabbed his coat and boots, prepared to face whatever was out there. The snowstorm continued to rage, but Jake knew he couldn't ignore the sound. He wasn't sure if it was an animal or something else. But there was no time to waste. He threw open the cabin door, the cold air hitting him like a wall. The snow immediately began to fill the cabin, but Jake stepped out into the swirling storm, his breath visible in the freezing air. The wind howled, but Jake pushed forward, determined to find the source of the sound. The snow was deep, nearly up to his knees, and every step felt like a battle. The storm whipped at him, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The snow blinded him, but he kept moving forward, following the noise. The whimpering was getting louder, closer. It was unmistakable now. A cry for help, desperate and weak. The trail led him deeper into the forest. The further Jake went, the more the storm seemed to close in around him. It was like the world was narrowing down to just him and the cry. His heart pounded, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He couldn't stop now. Then, through the blur of white, he saw it. There, half buried in a snowdrift, was a German shepherd, its body frozen, its breath shallow, but still there. The dog's eyes were wide with fear, and it was struggling weakly, trying to escape the snow that trapped it. Jake's heart stopped for a moment as he knelt beside the dog. It was clear that the animal was beyond exhausted. Its fur was matted with snow and ice, and its body was stiff from the cold. The dog let out a faint whimper as Jake gently touched its body. It had been trapped out here in the storm, fighting to survive, and now it was too weak to do anything but lie there. Jake didn't hesitate. He scooped the dog up into his arms, feeling its cold, stiff body against his chest. The dog was light, but Jake's heart was heavy with the weight of the situation. The storm had claimed its victims, but Jake wasn't going to let it take this one. He turned toward the cabin, carrying the dog through the snow, each step more difficult than the last. The storm was relentless, but so was he. He wasn't going to lose this animal to the cold. The cabin came into view as Jake trudged through the snow, the dog still in his arms, its breathing shallow but steady. The storm was fierce, but Jake had made it back to safety. He could only hope the dog would make it too. Jake carefully placed the German Shepherd on the floor of the cabin, close to the warmth of the fire. The storm outside raged on, the wind howling as the snow piled up higher around the cabin. The dog, now lying on a bed of blankets, was still weak and shivering. Jake had barely made it back with the dog before his own exhaustion started to catch up with him. His muscles burned from the long trek through the snow, and his breath came in deep, steadying gulps. The dog's condition was serious. Despite the warmth of the fire, it was clear that the German Shepherd had been out in the storm for too long. Its fur was matted with ice, and its body was stiff from the cold. Jake could still feel the dog's slight trembling beneath the blankets as he knelt beside it, watching with a growing sense of urgency. It needed more than just warmth. It needed to be revived. Jake grabbed a towel from the small shelf near the door and began gently rubbing the dog's fur, working to loosen the ice that clung to it. The dog whimpered weakly at first, its body stiff with pain, but Jake kept at it, not allowing himself to stop. He had to be gentle. He couldn't afford to hurt it further. Slowly, the dog's trembling subsided and its breathing deepened, becoming more regular. Jake could see its eyes flicker open, tired and wary, but still alive. The German Shepherd's gaze locked onto Jake's, full of confusion but also a spark of recognition. Jake's chest tightened as he looked into the dog's eyes. It was like the animal was searching for something. Maybe answers, maybe reassurance. But what could he say to a dog that had been left out in a storm? Its past likely filled with trauma. Jake didn't know, but he couldn't just leave it alone. Not now. The fire crackled behind him, casting a warm glow across the cabin. Jake sat back, taking a deep breath, and reached for the kettle. The cabin was small, but it was cozy. He had everything he needed to survive in this place. Everything except answers. And right now, he needed answers more than ever. Who was this dog? Why had it been out there alone in the storm? As Jake sat beside the dog, he began to notice more details. Things that hadn't caught his attention before. The scar on the dog's neck stood out, jagged and deep, like it had been made intentionally. It was too clean, too deliberate for a wilderness injury. Jake's mind raced. Could this dog have been part of a military program? He had heard of military and service dogs before, trained for dangerous missions, and then abandoned when they were no longer needed. But this wasn't a stray or a simple case of neglect. There was something about this dog that told Jake it had a deeper, more complex story. Who did this to you? Jake muttered under his breath, his fingers gently brushing the scar. The dog let out a soft whine at his touch, but it didn't pull away. There was trust in its eyes, something that made Jake feel the weight of responsibility even more. It wasn't just a dog. It was a living creature that had survived the odds, that had endured pain and suffering, and somehow had made it to him. The storm continued to batter the cabin, but inside, the warmth of the fire and the quiet companionship of the dog brought a sense of peace. Jake didn't want to think about the past, but he knew that whatever had happened to the dog, it had been through hell. And for some reason, the storm had led them both here. He couldn't ignore that. Jake stood up, pacing to the window to check on the storm. The visibility outside was still almost zero, the snow swirling in every direction, completely obscuring the world beyond. It was clear that they would be trapped in the cabin for a while longer. But Jake didn't mind. He had the dog now, and for whatever reason, it had been brought to him. He would take care of it. He would figure out what had happened to it. The dog stirred again, this time pushing itself up on its paws, its body still shaky from the ordeal. Jake turned back to it, his heart racing. "Easy now," he said softly, kneeling down beside it. "You're safe." The German Shepherd looked up at him with those tired, trusting eyes. And for a moment, Jake felt a strange connection. It was as though the dog understood him, understood that he wasn't a stranger. Jake wasn't sure how he knew it, but in that moment, he realized something. This wasn't just about survival. This was about redemption. The storm outside might have trapped them both, but inside, they were safe. And somehow, Jake knew that they would survive together. But the question that lingered in his mind was still unanswered. What had happened to the dog, and why had it been abandoned? The storm had continued its fury through the night, but by the morning, it had lost some of its power. Jake woke up early, as he always did, to find the cabin shrouded in an eerie silence. The wind was still howling outside, but the heavy snow had slowed. and the world was blanketed in a thick, pure white. Inside, the fire had burned low, casting faint shadows across the room. Jake stretched his stiff muscles, every inch of his body aching from the long hours of physical exertion. He turned to check on the German Shepherd, who was now curled up on the bed of blankets. The dog's eyes were closed, but it seemed to be sleeping soundly for the first time since Jake had found it. Its chest rose and fell rhythmically, a small but significant sign that it was recovering. The night had been long, and the cabin felt even more isolated than usual, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling of responsibility that had settled into his chest. This wasn't just another stray animal. This dog had a story, and Jake was starting to realize that he was a part of it now. He sat down on the edge of the bed, gently reaching for the dog's fur. The German Shepherd opened one eye, then the other, as if testing to see if Jake was still there. Jake didn't move, letting the dog take its time. The bond between them was already growing, something deeper than a simple rescue. "How are you feeling?" Jake asked quietly, his voice rough from sleep. The dog blinked at him, its eyes filled with exhaustion but also a quiet intelligence. Jake was starting to feel as though this dog was waiting for him to do something, waiting for Jake to unlock the truth behind what had happened. The dog let out a low, soft growl, and Jake stiffened. There was no aggression in it. The growl was more like a warning, a sign that the dog's instincts were still sharp, even if its body was battered and worn. Jake knew he had to be careful. This wasn't a normal dog, not in the way that he had first assumed. Jake reached for the dog's neck, the scar still visible under the thick layers of fur. As he touched it, the dog tensed again, but this time, it didn't pull away. Jake gently ran his fingers along the scar, the jagged lines of the wound standing out against the dog's fur. It was clear now this wasn't an injury from the wild. This was something deliberate. This scar had been inflicted. And that sent a chill down Jake's spine. The German Shepherd, now fully awake, stood up slowly, stretching its legs stiffly. Jake could see the strength returning to its muscles. But it wasn't just the dog's body that had been broken. It was its spirit too. A spirit that had been crushed by something far worse than the storm that had trapped it in the snow. Jake stood up as well, pacing the room. He had to figure this out. Something about the dog's presence, its behavior, its wariness, spoke of a past far darker than he could imagine. He had seen military dogs before, dogs used in dangerous missions, dogs who had been through things that no human could understand. But he never imagined one would end up like this. Alone. Abandoned. The more Jake thought about it, the more everything began to make sense. The dog wasn't just a survivor of the storm. It was a survivor of something far more brutal. It had been trained for a purpose, used for tasks no ordinary dog would ever be asked to do. It had been betrayed, left behind when it was no longer useful, and now it had been cast into the wilderness, forced to survive on its own. Jake felt a pang of sympathy for the dog. It wasn't just fighting the storm anymore. It was fighting a war that had been waged against it long before it ever met Jake. The more he thought about it, the more Jake realized that this wasn't just about saving a dog from a snowstorm. It was about saving the dog from a lifetime of trauma, from the horrors of war, from a past that it couldn't escape. And, for some reason, Jake was the one who had to help it heal. But, as he looked into the dog's eyes, he knew that the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. The dog had its own demons to fight, and Jake would need to be ready. But the one thing he knew for sure was that they weren't alone anymore. They had each other. And somehow, that made all the difference. The storm had calmed slightly by the morning, leaving a blanket of fresh snow covering everything outside. The world was silent, save for the occasional whistle of the wind and the crunch of snow beneath Jake's boots. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled steadily, filling the space with warmth, while Jake sat by the hearth, watching the German Shepherd, now awake and alert, pacing quietly in the corner of the room. Jake had been carefully observing the dog, still trying to gauge its physical condition and emotional state. The German Shepherd moved cautiously, its legs stiff, but it no longer appeared to be in immediate distress. It was strong, resilient, a survivor in every sense of the word. But Jake knew it wasn't just its body that needed healing. It was its mind, too. Jake had taken care of the physical injuries, making sure the dog's fur was free from ice and snow. But there was more to it. The scars on its neck haunted him. He couldn't shake the feeling that this dog had been through something far worse than being stranded in the snow. It had a history that had left deep, emotional scars that ran far deeper than the visible marks on its body. The German Shepherd stopped pacing and turned to face Jake. Its brown eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, there was complete silence. The storm outside seemed distant now, almost irrelevant, as Jake and the dog stood in the same space, both trying to come to terms with the situation. The connection between them had grown stronger in the past few hours. It wasn't just the fact that Jake had rescued the dog from the snowstorm. It was something deeper, something more unspoken. The German Shepherd trusted Jake, despite everything it had been through. And Jake, in return, had found something in the dog that resonated with him on a level he couldn't quite explain. The dog moved closer to Jake, its body tense but not fearful. It sniffed the air, its ears flicking slightly, and then lowered its head to the ground. Jake stayed still, waiting for the dog to approach on its own terms. There was no hurry. This wasn't about forcing trust. It was about earning it, slowly, patiently. The dog took another step forward and then stopped again, its eyes never leaving Jake's face. Jake's hand twitched at his side, but he didn't reach for the dog yet. It had to come to him first. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. The dog finally took the final step, its head lowering slightly, and Jake saw the subtle shift in its posture. It wasn't the aggressive stance it had shown earlier. Instead, there was a quiet submission, a silent surrender to the fact that, for whatever reason, it had found a moment of peace in this place. Jake reached out slowly, his hand extended but careful. He didn't want to frighten the dog, not when it was showing signs of trust. The German Shepherd hesitated for only a moment before leaning in, its nose gently brushing Jake's hand. It was brief, but in that moment, Jake felt an overwhelming sense of relief. It was as though the dog had finally realized it was safe, that it no longer needed to be afraid. Jake ran his fingers through the dog's fur, his touch gentle and slow. The dog closed its eyes, letting out a soft sigh as it settled down beside Jake. It wasn't fully relaxed, but it was a start. The storm outside had passed, and in that moment, Jake realized that the bond they had formed wasn't just about survival. It was about healing, both for the dog and for himself. For years, Jake had lived alone in the mountains, avoiding attachments, avoiding connections. He had chosen solitude because it was safer, simpler. But this dog had changed that. There was something about it, its resilience, its silent strength, that made Jake feel like he had been given a second chance. The German Shepherd needed him, but Jake needed it just as much. The fire in the hearth was warm, but the emotional warmth that spread between them was far more significant. The dog, though still wounded by its past, was starting to trust again, and Jake, for the first time in a long while, felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't alone anymore. The storm had brought them together, but it was the quiet moments, the unspoken trust, that would truly heal them both. And in that moment, Jake knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. Jake woke up early, as usual, the quiet of the cabin wrapping around him like a familiar blanket. The storm had passed, but the aftermath was clear. Snow piled high outside, creating a world of white that stretched endlessly in every direction. Inside, the cabin was warm, the fire still glowing faintly in the hearth. He had slept more soundly than he had in days, but his mind was far from at ease. The German Shepherd lay beside the fire, now fully awake, its fur dry and warm. Jake had worked through the night to care for it, but as he looked at the dog now, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to the story than he had first thought. The dog had been through so much. The storm was just the last in a series of hardships that had shaped it into the creature Jake now shared this cabin with. But what had happened to this dog before the storm? What had it gone through to end up half dead in the snow? Jake rose from the chair, his joints stiff from the cold night, and moved toward the dog. The German Shepherd lifted its head slightly as Jake approached, eyes soft but filled with wariness. Jake knelt beside it, reaching out slowly to stroke the dog's fur. It flinched slightly but didn't pull away. There was progress. A small, quiet victory. "You're doing better," Jake murmured, his voice soft. The dog's response was a slight wag of its tail, barely perceptible, but meaningful. Jake smiled, a sense of relief washing over him. It wasn't much, but it was a sign that the dog was beginning to trust him. But there was still a lingering question in Jake's mind. The scar on the dog's neck, the one he had noticed yesterday, haunted him. It was no ordinary wound. It was too precise, too deliberate. A scar from a knife, not an accident. Could this dog have been a part of something far darker than he could imagine? He couldn't ignore the possibilities. But there was something inside him that didn't want to believe it. Jake walked over to the small table by the window and grabbed a piece of paper. He scribbled down some notes, trying to put his thoughts into order. There were too many questions, too many unknowns. The dog had been abandoned. That much was clear. But why? Who would leave an animal like this, trained for something else, to die in the storm? He looked over at the dog again, now lying on the floor near the fire. Its eyes were closed, but Jake could see the tension in its muscles. The way it was still hyper-aware of everything around it. The dog wasn't completely at ease. It was still haunted by whatever it had experienced. The emotional scars ran just as deep as the physical ones. Jake sat back down, thinking for a moment. He could feel a sense of urgency growing inside him. He had to find out more about this dog. He couldn't just let it recover and forget about its past. The storm had brought it to him, but the mystery behind it was only beginning to unravel. Just then, the dog stirred, lifting its head and letting out a low growl. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He turned toward it, eyes narrowing. The growl wasn't aggressive. It was defensive, like the dog was trying to protect itself from something unseen. Jake held his breath, watching the dog closely. Was it a reaction to something he'd said? Or was it remembering something? Some part of its past that made it wary of everything, even safety. The dog stood up, its legs still shaky, and took a step back from Jake. It was watching him now, with a sharp, focused gaze. It wasn't aggressive, but there was something in its eyes. Something that told Jake the dog wasn't just trying to survive the storm. It was fighting something deeper, something Jake couldn't yet understand. Jake rose cautiously, not wanting to startle the dog, and moved closer. "It's okay," he said softly, trying to reassure it. "I'm not going anywhere." The German Shepherd stared at him for a long moment, before slowly lowering its head, the growl fading into a soft sigh. It was still on edge, still wary of something, but it had softened just enough to show Jake that it was willing to trust him. Just a little bit more. Jake sighed and sat back down, his thoughts heavy with the weight of everything the dog had been through. There was more to this than just a storm. There was a history, a darkness, that neither he nor the dog could escape. And Jake knew that finding out the truth was the only way to help the German Shepherd heal. The morning after the storm had passed, the sun rose weakly over the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape. Jake had been awake for hours, the cabin now quiet except for the faint crackling of the fire in the hearth. The German Shepherd was still resting near the warmth of the fire, its body recovering from the ordeal it had faced. Jake had seen signs of improvement. Its breathing had become more regular, and it seemed more relaxed than it had been the night before. But Jake's mind was far from at ease. The questions that had been building in his head were only growing more urgent. The scar on the dog's neck, the one that had sent chills down his spine, was just the tip of the iceberg. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the dog's past was something far darker than he had imagined. The storm had been a mere coincidence, but finding the dog had been fate. And Jake knew that fate hadn't just brought the dog to him for a random rescue. There was a purpose behind this, something that Jake couldn't ignore. The German Shepherd shifted slightly, its eyes flicking open, and it looked up at Jake. There was a quiet understanding in its gaze now, something that wasn't there the day before. The dog was no longer afraid. But what was it that had made it so cautious in the first place? What had it gone through that had left it broken, abandoned, and frozen in the snow? Jake sat down on the nearby chair, his fingers rubbing his temples as he tried to gather his thoughts. He needed to know more. There had to be something in the dog's past that would explain why it had been left to die in the snow. He had to uncover the truth. And then, as if on cue, the dog stood up. Slowly, it walked toward Jake, its movements still stiff, but purposeful. The dog stopped just a few feet away from him, and looked up, as though waiting for Jake to do something. It was strange. The dog wasn't acting like a stray or a wounded animal anymore. It was acting like it knew Jake would take care of it, like it had already made the decision to trust him. But was that trust genuine, or was it just survival instinct kicking in? Jake reached out slowly, carefully, not wanting to startle the dog. The German Shepherd leaned in, its nose brushing his hand, and for the first time, Jake could feel the full weight of the connection between them. This was more than just a rescue. It was something deeper, something unspoken, that was drawing them together. The dog let out a low whine, and Jake's hand froze mid-motion. He looked down at the dog, his eyes narrowing as he noticed something else. A small patch of fur on the dog's chest that was darker than the rest. It wasn't just the physical scar on its neck. The dog's chest bore another mark, one that was even more significant. The fur was thin in that spot, and Jake could see the shape of a tattoo beneath it. Jake's heart skipped a beat as he knelt down to get a closer look. The tattoo was small, faded, but the numbers were still visible. Kane 203. The realization hit him like a punch in the gut. This dog had been part of something far bigger than he could have imagined. It wasn't just a random stray or a lost animal caught in the storm. It was a military dog, a trained soldier. Jake's pulse quickened as he backed away slightly, taking in the full weight of the revelation. This wasn't just an animal that had been abandoned. This was a soldier, a tool used for missions, sent out to fight in wars that Jake could barely comprehend. And now, here it was, broken, betrayed, and abandoned in the wilderness. Jake looked at the dog, his heart heavy with guilt and anger. How could someone do this to an animal that had given everything for them? It wasn't just the storm that had caused this dog's suffering. It had been discarded, thrown away like it didn't matter anymore. The dog's gaze never wavered from Jake's face. There was no anger in its eyes, no bitterness, only the same quiet understanding that had been there from the beginning. This dog had seen the worst that humanity had to offer, and yet it was still capable of trusting again. It wasn't just a soldier, it was a survivor. Jake reached down and gently scratched behind the dog's ears, the bond between them solidifying in that moment. He had been given a second chance, and so had the dog. Whatever had happened in his past, Jake knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let it face that future alone. The storm had brought them together, but it was the truth, the revelation of what this dog had endured, that had truly changed everything. And now, they would heal together. Jake and the German Shepherd had come through the storm, but their journey together was just beginning. In the quiet bond they shared, they had both found something they didn't know they needed. A second chance. As they looked at each other, there was no doubt. They would heal together, side by side, facing whatever came next. If this story of survival and redemption touched your heart, make sure to subscribe, like, and share it with someone who believes in second chances. Stay tuned for more stories of courage and hope.